Welcome back to the deep dive, and thank you for trusting us with your sources today. Really fascinating, challenging material.
Definitely some heavy stuff here.
We are wading deep into macro-political analysis today, specifically unpacking these systemic changes within the United States, often called, Trump's change. Our mission today, really, is to tackle the core question from this material. Is this just a political realignment? Or does this set of reforms represent something more fundamental, maybe a revolutionary challenge?
And the comparison point is key here.
Exactly. Could it, like Mikhail Gorbachev's internal reforms in the Soviet Union, maybe lead to an unintentional systemic collapse of the existing U.S. global structure?
What's immediately striking from the sources you provided is just the sheer scale of the analysis. I mean, we're not talking about a normal 4-year policy cycle here.
No, definitely not.
The material frames the United States, well, not just as a modern superpower, but almost as a historical entity, a great power whose global influence is compared to foundational empires. They specifically mention Rome or the Han Dynasty.
Wow, okay. So that really elevates the stakes.
It does. And this comparison is crucial because it implies the U.S. influence isn't just military or economic, it's structural, deeply structural. Post-World War II, the sources argue, the U.S. established and, well, sustained 3 distinct global orders.
The 3 orders.
Yes. And a change of the magnitude being discussed now, starting right at the center of that system, it potentially threatens everything built upon it.
Okay, let's unpack that scale right now then. We need to understand the foundation that might be shaking. Before we get into the changes themselves, what are these 3 crucial orders the U.S. established, the ones now potentially unraveling?
Okay, let's start with the kind of central pillar, the one that, in theory, guarantees stability for the others. That's the internal national democratic order.
Right, the system at home.
Exactly, the U.S. political system itself.
Yeah.
Adherence to the rule of law, the checks and balances structure, the values of democratic stability, and overall the political model that the rest of the world has either, well, admired or had to contend with for decades.
Okay, so that's the internal blueprint.
Yes.
And the external orders are sort of the projection of that.
Precisely. That's a good way to put it. The second is the regional order.
Alliances.
Yes. This covers the complex U.S. alliance structure built up over, many years. NATO in Europe, the security treaties in the Asia-Pacific. It's the mechanism by which the U.S. integrates its power with key allies. The goal being regional stability, preventing conflict.
Got it. And the third, the biggest one.
And finally, the third, the largest framework, the international order. This is the broad U.S.-led global system, what people often call the liberal international order.
Okay.
It includes all the multilateral institutions, the UN, WTO, IMF, the trade agreements, the non-proliferation norms, basically the global rules of the road that have governed international relations since 1945, more or less.
And the sources seem to agree that the internal system is the key.
Absolutely unified on that. The assessment is that the internal system is the master switch. If the democratic order breaks down domestically the other two, well, they inevitably follow suit.
That sets the stakes incredibly high. Okay, let's jump into part 1 then. Deconstructing Trump's change. The sources describe this as a comprehensive internal reconstruction, focused almost entirely on seizing the machinery of domestic governance.
Yes, and the analysts identify 4 key areas where this internal order is being fundamentally challenged. And these are, deeply systemic challenges. They go way beyond typical political maneuvering.
Okay, let's start with the most visible shift. The politicization of the political system. How does the source material define this Trump-eurization phenomena?
Well, traditionally, American politics involved, 2 large, relatively pragmatic parties debating policy within an agreed-upon constitutional framework.
Right, Republicans and Democrats arguing over taxes or health care.
Exactly. But the source argues that this is fundamentally dissolving. The political landscape is now Trump-ilized. And what that means is traditional party politics, the sort of nuanced differences between Republican and Democratic platforms, they're increasingly being replaced.
Replaced by what?
By politics driven by raw populism, identity, and frankly, personality cults. This shift is significant because the sources suggest it's actively influencing and maybe eroding core democratic principles. The focus shifts from institutional loyalty, loyalty to Congress or the judiciary, to absolute loyalty to a single figure or movement.
So less about the institution, more about the person.
Precisely. And the fundamental split is no longer just a policy debate. It's evolved into the basic structure of internal societal conflict. It makes consensus almost impossible.
Okay, so if the system itself is politicized in that way, The next logical step seems to be weaponizing the tools of government,
That's where it goes.
which takes us to the changes in the system of checks and balances. The sources suggest this is under direct assault, particularly from the executive branch.
That's absolutely right. The U.S. Constitution, relies heavily on the separation of powers, executive, legislative, judicial. Right. And the analysis shows the Trump movement leveraging what the source calls extraordinary ability and specific political skills to intentionally disrupt this balance.
How are they doing that, according to the sources? You mentioned administrative tactics.
Yeah.
Targeting the bureaucracy.
Exactly. The focus is squarely on the executive branch intervening in places like the Department of Justice, the judiciary. The explicit goal cited is to target and dismantle the administrative bureaucracy.
The career civil servants.
Yes, the career civil servants, often referred to by the movement as the deep state.
Right.
Tactics cited include using executive orders for, mass reclassification of civil servants. Things like Schedule F proposals are mentioned, implicitly or explicitly.
And Schedule F would.
What? It would essentially remove employment protections for potentially tens of thousands of federal employees, making them easier to fire and replace. The clear intention is to replace them with politically vetted loyalists, to neutralize the nonpartisan expertise that traditionally provided some institutional resistance or, continuity.
So bypassing the professional layer.
Correct. Now, the sources do note that judicial and congressional pushback, particularly from those valuing traditional American values, has struggled to fully counter these moves. But the mere attempt to dismantle the career service, that fundamentally shifts the balance of power towards the executive. It's a huge change.
That's a direct challenge to the, competence and independence of the state itself. Okay, so if federal agencies are being centralized or politicized like this, how does that affect the relationship between Washington and the rest of the country?
Good question.
That brings us to the third internal shift the sources highlight. Central-local government dynamics.
Right, and this is where that centralization really hits the ground. The aim described is to quickly and dramatically change the historical and legal relationship between the federal and local governments. The explicit strategy is limiting the power of federal agencies in some ways, but also limiting the local autonomy guaranteed by law, particularly, and this is key, in jurisdictions controlled by the political opposition.
Okay, the sources specifically mention targeting pro-Democrat states and cities. What kind of tensions are we actually talking about here? Is it just funding fights?
It starts there, maybe. Tension manifests over issues like immigration enforcement, environmental regulations, local economic policies where states or cities might resist federal directives. But the ultimate threat described is much more profound.
More profound how?
Here's where it gets really interesting and, frankly, quite alarming based on the source material. There are reports cited suggesting that Trump has even considered using the federal military assets against local political entities.
Using the U.S. military.
Domestically.
Against states or cities.
The analysis highlights the specific consideration of deploying federal forces against anti-Trump states and cities controlled by Democrats. The stated purpose would be to enforce federal will or potentially quell dissent.
Wow.
This isn't just political brinkmanship described here. It's portrayed as a potential institutional breakdown. The central government potentially viewing opposition jurisdictions not as political rivals, but as internal threats requiring military suppression.
That's a profound threat to the whole federal structure of the United States. Using federal forces against legally constituted internal opposition, that's a level of institutional conflict we haven't seen in generations.
Exactly. It fundamentally alters the nature of the Union.
And underpinning all this political maneuvering, there's the fourth shift, the ideological and values shift. This seems to be the fuel.
It absolutely is. The sources characterize Trump's ideological movement as a forceful return to traditional, often religious, political, conservative values.
Okay.
And this movement stands in direct, almost militant opposition to what the sources label modern, diversified values.
So we're talking about the culture wars, specifically targeting concepts like diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, cultural politics, LGBTQ rights, that sort of thing.
Precisely those things, yes. But the material stresses a crucial, deeper point here.
Which is?
That this isn't just the fleeting political preference of one administration or one person. These ideological changes are described as being rooted in deep structural foundations of American society. Meaning it's potentially a reaction against rapid demographic and cultural change, a powerful pushback. And the implication is that this pushback is so structurally embedded that it would continue to drive political change and reconstruction, even if the figurehead were to change.
So it has momentum beyond just one leader.
That's the argument. It gives the movement a potential for profound longevity.
That paints a picture of a nation undergoing a self-directed structural renovation, not just swapping out some policies.
Oh.
Okay, let's transition now from the domestic battlefield to how this new internally focused U.S. might project its power internationally. Or perhaps not project it.
Right.
Part 2. The inward turn. The analysis highlights a fundamental shift in military strategy and foreign policy priorities, moving from the global periphery, as they call it, to the domestic backyard.
Yes, and this internal focus is apparently being visibly codified within the military establishment itself, suggesting a redirection of the state's most powerful tool.
And the evidence cited is quite specific and highly symbolic, isn't it? Let's talk about the renaming of the military department. That seems like a massive symbolic shift, but maybe functional too.
It's huge symbolically. The source highlights a September 5th executive order restoring the name of the U.S. Department of Defense back to the Department of War. Or, maybe more accurately translated from the source material, the Department of Warfare, or fighting.
Department of War. That has a very different ring to it than Department of Defense.
Completely different. The practical difference might seem small on paper, but the symbolic shift is immense. It signals a move away from the whole post-Cold War concept of defense and soft power projection towards a focus purely on, lethal force and combat readiness.
And along with that name change came a clear mandate regarding the internal composition and training of the military forces, something about DEI.
Correct. The order reportedly mandates a comprehensive purge of DEI and other policies described as harmful, diversified policies, things the movement views as undermining military readiness.
So, stripping out perceived social engineering.
That seems to be the goal. The focus is to swing entirely towards performance, discipline, and merit, while reforming training to focus exclusively on combat skills. Decoupling the military's purpose from any perceived social role, this is presented as an immediate operational impact of that broader ideological shift we just discussed.
But the sources also cite this rather mysterious gathering, the Mystery Summit. What was the significance of that September 30th meeting for senior military officers? It sounded highly politicized.
It did. U.S. media covering the event called it precedent-setting and a highly political transformation. The analysis suggests the secrecy, the choice of venues, often rural, politically safe cities, far from traditional military hubs like D.C. or major bases, were deliberate choices.
Why? What did it signal?
It signaled a major shift in strategic priorities, potentially bypassing the traditional Pentagon establishment, according to this analysis.
Okay. And this is where the commentary gets genuinely concerning.
Yeah.
Based on the sources.
Yes. U.S. media commentary, and the source specifically cites analysis attributed to The Economist, suggested these preparations weren't just about external threats. They were potentially laying the groundwork for potential civil war, or at least severe internal conflict.
Civil war, that's strong language.
Extremely strong. The locations chosen, the tone reported, suggested preparation for domestic defense or internal security operations, with a focus solely on the Western Hemisphere.
So the core objective of this newly focused Department of War might not be projecting power to deter China in the Pacific or Russia in Europe.
But rather ensuring internal stability and controlling the immediate region. Yes, that's the interpretation presented. It's a profound operational retraction from global commitments.
The source material confirms this interpretation through what it calls the MGA lens.
It does. The military shift's focus is interpreted as clear. Preparation for fighting external enemies, or, and this seems much more likely given the surrounding policy rhetoric cited, preparation for domestic defense, focusing exclusively on the American continental landmass and its immediate sphere of influence.
And instructions given were aimed at making MAGIA great again.
That's the commentary cited, yes. Specifically mentioning Axios commentary indicating instructions were oriented towards making MAGIA great again, which implies prioritizing domestic security above all else.
This internal military focus then logically dictates the new foreign policy priorities, doesn't it? If the military is turning inward, foreign policy has to follow.
It has to. The priority hierarchy laid out is explicit. Domestic, periphery, backyard.
Okay, break that down.
Yes. The old system of global engagement is replaced by a clear triage. First, domestic issues. Everything else serves that. Then the periphery, meaning Mexico and Canada.
Our closest neighbors and allies.
Traditionally, yes. But the source notes the U.S. now relies on explicit, almost coercive tools to control their economies, curb illegal immigration and drug trafficking, and impose non-traditional trade barriers. Things like tariffs or quotas specifically targeting border flows. The relationship becomes much more transactional, driven by U.S. domestic concerns and pain points.
Less alliance, more control.
That's the implication. And then there's the backyard Latin America.
How is that viewed?
This vast region is explicitly viewed as the U.S.'s own sphere of influence, naturally. But it's also seen as structurally unstable, rife with political polarization, social unrest, significant issues with crime and drugs. And these are viewed primarily as threats imported across the border into the U.S.
So the policy isn't about development.
It signals less interest in development aid or partnership and much more interest in stabilization and control, keeping the problems over there.
And there was another definitive symbolic action mirroring the Department of War renaming. Something about the border.
Absolutely. A January 20th executive order, reportedly already in effect in the source timeline, officially changes the name Mexico border to the American border.
American border, not U.S.-Mexico border.
No, just American border. This is portrayed as a powerful declaration. It unilaterally dissolves the concept of the border as a shared international line, redefining it solely as the domestic boundary of the American sphere. It signals a very zero-sum, control-oriented approach to regional relations.
This policy of intense regional control, combined with simultaneous global retreat, raises critical questions about international power vacuums, surely.
Huge questions.
The source even cites concerning reports mentioning Newsweek specifically suggesting potential conflict in Central or South America. What does this overall shift mean for U.S. influence globally, especially regarding rivals like China?
Well, this policy pretty much guarantees retreat on the global stage. By focusing its resources, military, economic, political capital so intensely inward and locally, the U.S. is fundamentally reducing its capacity to project soft power or manage rival influence elsewhere.
And China?
China, which is already heavily invested in infrastructure and trade across Latin America, not to mention Africa and Asia, will inevitably find these vacuums opening up. More space to operate, less U.S. pushback. It creates a dangerous paradox, really. The U.S. asserts absolute control over its backyard, but its refusal to engage diplomatically or economically beyond these coercive measures might actually ensure the region remains unstable.
Which then justifies the inward focus.
Exactly. It could become a self-fulfilling cycle of instability and retrenchment. More instability requires more inward focus, which creates more vacuums, potentially leading to more instability. You see the loop.
Potentially dangerous cycle. Okay, we've thoroughly established the internal and external scope of Trump's change, as described in these sources. Now let's pivot to the central analytical framework of this deep dive, that comparison to the Soviet collapse.
Right.
Part 3, the Gorbachev parallel.
And again, the parallel isn't really about personality or ideology. It's about the potential systemic consequences of attempting revolutionary change from within a superpower structure.
Gorbachev intended to save the Soviet system, right, with perestroika and glasnost.
He absolutely did. But those reforms inadvertently triggered its complete dissolution and, of course, the end of the Cold War. The source uses this history as a kind of cautionary model, exploring the potential risks for the U.S. system now.
So to understand the potential danger for the U.S., let's quickly recall the structure that actually broke down in the USSR. What was the sequence?
The analysis attributes Gorbachev's outcome to the sequential breakdown of 4 interconnected systems. It mirrors the 3 U.S. orders we discussed, but with the added complexity of the satellite states.
Okay, what were the 4?
First, the collapse of the Soviet internal order, its political and economic structure. Second, the rapid internal political transformation of the Eastern European satellite states breaking free. Third, the dissolution of the military alliance, the Warsaw Pact treaty structure.
Then the final step.
And finally, the ultimate consequence. The breakup of the Soviet Union itself into constituent republics, a complete systemic collapse.
And the fear for the U.S., according to the source, is that the current structural problems we've discussed, the politicization, the ideological conflict, the executive overreach, are so deep.
So deep that if they aren't fundamentally resolved, they risk triggering a revolution. And the core analytical tension is whether that revolution, if it happens, is contained or if it spirals into uncontrollable dissolution, similar in effect, if not in form, to the Soviet experience.
And this comes back to why the internal structure matters so much to you, the listener, wherever you are in the world.
Absolutely, because the fate of the U.S. internal democratic order will inevitably profoundly affect the other two global orders. It could trigger a systemic domino effect, maybe not identical, but akin in impact to what the world witnessed in 1989 through 91.
Okay, let's trace those potential global impacts. The erosion of the three U.S. orders, starting with the collapse of the U.S. as the democratic ideal.
Right. In the Democratic camp, internal order, the actions described accelerate a global trend when the primary global model of democracy is seen openly struggling.
Its stability questioned, elections doubted, rule of law challenged.
Exactly. When that happens, its authority to promote democracy worldwide just diminishes significantly. This provides enormous geopolitical space for autocracies, for traditional centralized regimes to push back against liberal norms. They can just point and say, see, the American model is fundamentally flawed, maybe even defunct.
It weakens the whole democracy brand, so to speak.
It really does. And what happens then to the extensive regional order, that network of alliances we talked about?
What's the impact there?
This suffers from accelerated withdrawal and neglect, according to the analysis. U.S. withdrawal from regional security and economic structures, whether it's strategic indifference in Europe or more transactional demands in the Asia-Pacific, it creates massive instability and power vacuums.
Forcing allies to adapt.
Forcing allies to adapt, often drastically. They might have to dramatically increase independent defense spending, or, as the sources note, seek new regional arrangements for their own survival, potentially excluding the U.S.
And this leads to fragmentation.
It accelerates what the source terms ghettoization into regional blocs. For example, European states might focus entirely on EU-centric defense, becoming more inwardly focused themselves. Asian nations like Japan, South Korea, Australia might be forced into more direct, possibly conflicting independent security postures. The world fragments into these blocs, potentially fighting for regional dominance without that stabilizing or at least mediating U.S. presence.
And the largest global effect, the breakdown of the international order.
Well, withdrawal from key international institutions and multilateral treaties just accelerates the breakdown of the entire post-WWII system.
Because the U.S. built it, largely.
When the main architect, and for a long time the main guarantor of the system, the U.S. abandons treaties, walks away from multilateralism, the framework just unravels quickly. The source warns this inevitably leads to a retreat from global governance towards a world of groups fighting.
A more chaotic world.
Defined by transactional relationships, fear of influence politics, it reverses decades of attempts at global cooperation.
Okay, we've established the parallels in potential consequence.
Yeah.
Profound, unintended systemic instability for both the U.S. and the USSR. But now we hit the key analytical distinction. The thing the source material really demands we spend time on. The difference between the economic base and the political superstructure.
Yes, this is absolutely the core intellectual insight offered to differentiate the two transformations. And we really need to define these concepts clearly as the source uses them in a specific, almost Marxist analytical way.
Right. So the base is?
The base is the economic foundation. It's the means of production factories, technology, resources, and crucially, the production relations, how society organizes the economy, ownership, labor.
That's superstructure.
The superstructure is everything built upon that economic foundation. It includes the legal system, the political system, the state power structure, the dominant ideology, the culture, education, everything that shapes and justifies the base.
Okay, base is economy, superstructure is politics, ideology, law. How does that apply to the Soviet Union and Gorbachev?
Gorbachev's reform, perestroika, was fundamentally aimed at solving a crisis of the economic base. The Soviet system was plagued by deep, undeniable economic stagnation.
Things weren't working.
No. The centralized, non-market production relations were failing to provide basic goods, failing to innovate. The economy was, well, rotten at its core, and the reform perestroika for the economy, glasnost for the political superstructure, was a desperate attempt to open things up, to try and save that failing base.
But the base was too weak.
The argument is the base was so fundamentally broken that when the superstructure was cracked open with glasnost, the whole thing just couldn't hold. It collapsed.
But the U.S. situation is fundamentally different, isn't it? The U.S. economy, its technology base, remains incredibly dynamic and powerful despite challenges.
Exactly. That's the crucial difference highlighted. Trump's reform, conversely, is not portrayed as being driven by economic collapse. The U.S. remains, arguably, the technological and financial engine of the world.
So what is driving it then?
His reform, according to this analysis, is focused squarely on the political and ideological superstructure.
The politics, the ideology, the state apparatus.
Yes. The movement argues, implicitly or explicitly, that the existing political and administrative superstructure, the institutions, the bureaucracy, the ideology of the ruling elite, the deep state, is no longer serving the interests of or is actively hindering what they see as U.S. foundational capitalism.
So if the economic base is strong, the revolution isn't about fixing the economy, it's about who controls the superstructure.
Yeah.
And how that superstructure manages the relationship with the economy, the production relations.
Precisely. That nails it. The sources argue that Trump's movement fundamentally represents the interests of a particular segment of U.S. foundational capitalism. Perhaps those who feel hampered by regulations, by global commitments, by cultural shifts they see as unproductive. Therefore, the Trump change is viewed primarily as a revolution targeting the superstructure. The political system, the administrative state, the prevailing ideological consensus. It's framed as an attempt to make the governance structure more efficient, more responsive, more loyal to what they define as core capitalist interests, not an attempt to fix a fundamentally broken economy like Gorbachev faced.
So it's fascinating. Both leaders sought to make great again in their own contexts. Gorbachev wanted to revitalize a failing Soviet Union. Trump wants to make America great again. But the means, and crucially, the target system's base versus superstructure, are fundamentally inverted.
Completely inverted. And that leads to completely different revolutionary dynamics and risks.
How so? What are the different dynamics?
Well, Gorbachev was arguably forced into change by undeniable economic failure. The system wasn't delivering. Trump, in this view, is seizing control of a system with a still healthy economic base and demanding that the existing superstructure, the political and administrative elite, the cultural norms, be entirely rebuilt, repurposed, and loyalized.
And the risk there?
The risk is that the sheer force required to dismantle that existing, entrenched superstructure creates massive institutional instability that could spiral out of control, even if the underlying economy remains strong, at least initially. It's a political revolution, not primarily an economic one.
And this brings us back to the severity of the methods being used or contemplated. The source materials seem to focus heavily on this idea that the means might end up defining the outcome, regardless of the stated goal of improvement or efficiency.
That is the ultimate warning woven through the analysis. The author explicitly notes that some sources they consulted even used the term fascism to describe the potential resulting state of rule.
Fascism, that's obviously a very loaded term. How is it being used here?
It's crucial to understand how it's used. It's not used here, according to the author, to describe the economic base which remains capitalist. It's used to describe the methods of rule and the nature of the superstructure being built, such as the politicization of the military, the undermining of checks and balances, the dismantling of the neutral bureaucracy for political loyalty, the potential use of state power against internal political opposition, the focus on nationalism and a strong leader. Those methods, the sources argue, are creating a new political reality.
A reality based more on personal loyalty and executive authority, rather than institutional constraints and the rule of law.
That's the core concern expressed. If the stated goal is simply a more efficient superstructure aligned with certain capitalist interests, but the methods involve these kinds of radical breaks with democratic norms, those methods themselves might be creating a fundamentally different and perhaps unstable political system.
So what does this all mean for the outcome? If the U.S.'s problems, according to this movement, are rooted in the political superstructure and its relationship with production and not the economic fundamentals, then the revolution is primarily about power and political ideology.
Yes. And the key question then becomes, can a revolution focus purely on the superstructure, executed through potentially radical and destructive means, actually achieve long-term stability?
Unlike the Soviet case, where the whole structure dissolved because the economic base was rotten.
The U.S. structure might fracture internally, politically, ideologically, even while the economy, for a time, remains strong. It raises the, frankly, terrifying possibility that in a political revolution aimed mainly at restructuring power relationships, the means become the end.
The means define the result.
The dramatic actions described renaming the military to the Department of War, considering military action against internal dissent, dismantling global structures, these actions may irrevocably define the resulting system, define it as one prone to chronic internal conflict, permanent ideological warfare, regardless of whether that system continues to generate wealth efficiently for some.
So, will the means used by the current movement end up defining the revolution, regardless of its starting intentions. That really is something for you, the well-informed learner, to consider as these systemic developments unfold.
If the goal is stability and efficiency, but the path leads through political purges and the politicization of state violence, what kind of system truly emerges at the end of that road?
An essential question remains, posed by the source material. If this system is successfully rebuilt in this radical manner, will it actually be more stable? Or will the very methods of disruption lead to a permanent, chaotic state of internal conflict that eventually degrades the economic base as well?
That's the long-term unknown. The comparison with Gorbachev isn't about predicting collapse necessarily, but about understanding that radical change, even aimed at improvement, can have deeply destabilizing, unforeseen consequences when applied to a complex superpower system.
A truly profound deep dive today into the nature of political power, systemic change, and historical parallels. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.